Rolling.
So here we are. You know what? We got to talk about that for a moment.
Why?
You'll know why. In fact, you do know why. You just don't realize it. But
Yeah, because, yeah.
Anyway, we always have a problem of having a way to introduce Tune X podcast, which is what everybody's listening to right now. I think it's episode 14 or so, or is it 15? I don't remember. But hey, it's on the podcast data. But I think I have a solution for this episode as to how to introduce it. Now, I will hand this over to you. Here's a little script that I had generated by an artificial intelligence generator. So here's how it's going to go. Hello, everyone. This is Sean, and I'm joined today by my wonderful wife, Lisa, for another episode of Tune X Podcast, in which we share our love and obsession for the Beach Boys. Today, we're exploring a truly transformative year for the band, 1965.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with Sean to talk about one of our favorite years in the history of the Beach Boys. 1965 was a time of musical growth and artistic expression, and I can't wait to dive into the music and events of this period with all of you.
There, that took care of everything.
Sure.
Artificially intelligence-generated podcast intro. Can't recommend it enough.
Oh, so that's why it sounds like it was written by a sick leprechaun?
Because it probably was.
Yeah.
Indeed. So, yeah, and since the last time we recorded, in fact, this is just very recently, of course, we all know the news that it has been determined
By science,
that there are two Beach Boys songs. What is it? The top 10 songs that scientifically make people happy?
Yep.
One of which makes me angry, actually.
Yeah, but that's because you're you.
And it's because of how I was raised, probably. But number one was Good Vibrations.
Yep.
And this came out right around the time of the 57th, was it 57th anniversary? Yeah, of the first ever Good Vibrations
of
session.
the day that somebody actually said, Good Vibrations, take one. Probably thinking, yeah, we'll get through this in a couple takes and we'll be out of here in time for dinner. No!
Yeah, we'll hear the song when it's on the radio.
Yeah. This is going to be easy. No, it wasn't. But let's talk about that more on another day.
Yeah.
Because we could easily go on for a whole podcast just about Good Vibrations.
Oh, my goodness.
So let's stop ourselves before we get too crazy.
Yeah. And one thing, we had, those of you who listen to us regularly, you know that in our previous episode, which has been a while, but we're back, we had a special guest, David Leaf, come to talk about his book and other things, Brian and non-Brian. And he recently reached out to me and he wanted me to let everybody know that there's a new link for the Reader's Guide to God Only Knows, the story of the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, the California Myth. I think I got that backwards, actually. It's a long title. Do I have to do this all over again?
Yes.
Anyway, that link is in the show notes at tunex.fab4it.com, Fab4IT being spelled F-A-B and the number 4-I-T. And that's our website. That's also where you're going to get the show notes. And speaking of which, finally, for well over a year, there has been a resources coming soon link on our webpage. It now no longer says coming soon because there are some actual resources there, external links where you can buy some books, visit some other online resources. It's a constant work in progress. And just one more thing. I know I mentioned it before, but if you go to our website, assuming that I put something in there, every day it'll tell you what happened on this day in Beach Boys history. So if there's more than one thing that happened on that day, it'll pull something out at random. So that's pretty nifty if you want to learn something as to what the Beach Boys and related stuff was happening back then. But in the meantime, as we both told you before, this episode, we're taking a look at what is probably the most transitional years in Beach Boys history, when things really started to ramp up in terms of creativity and whatever else have you. This is when the proverbial gets real. We all know that proverb, right? A lot was going on.
And really, in our study and discussion of this to prepare for this podcast, we actually don't limit this to just the year 1965.
The hell you say?
We actually dial things back to June of 1964. So when you look at the scope of what was going on in 1965, you have to go back a little bit because that's where the roots of a lot of things happened.
I think one of the reasons we went back to June 1964 is because, at least in my mind, when I think Beach Boys 1965, I go in terms of albums. The Beach Boys Today, Summer Days, Summer Nights, and Beach Boys Party, of course. The first thing that happened for all of that actually was in June of 64 when the Beach Boys recorded Don't Hurt My Little Sister.
Yep, June 22nd.
So think about how so many people say that aside from Pet Sounds, the Beach Boys Today is their favorite Beach Boys album, and it's a very Pet Sounds Clue-y album, an early clue to the new direction, as it were. Before I Get Around, it was even a number one hit, is when they started working on this really transformative work.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting when you think about, what is this song about? Many sources speculate, and I think rightfully so, that it's one Rovell sister speaking to Brian about another Rovell sister. The little sister could be Marilyn, but we don't really know for sure because, let's be honest, I think Brian was kind of interested in all of them at the time.
Oh, yeah.
For various reasons.
Well, yeah, each of them had
levels.
something that Brian liked, that a unique feature about their personalities, I think.
Well, he also just liked them as singers, too.
Well, that too.
And we know that he also really loved going over to their house,
Yeah.
and their mom loved to cook for him.
Good old May. Yep. And by the way, yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about Don't Hurt My Little Sister. And as I'm looking at our notes, we have something for just about every day. But we're not going to go day by day, song by song. We're not going to do it.
Well, I think we have.
But for some things,
we have just cause for talking about this song
Absolutely.
first. Just because, again, it's the first song for a 1965 album that was recorded. And going with the assumption that it's about a Rovell, Brian was married to a Rovell sister by the time the year was out.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, I think, a sign of a change in that the content of a lot of the songs was becoming more and more personal.
Oh, yeah.
As we go forward, there's not a lot of just random filler Moon and June kind of love songs. A lot of the material that Brian was putting together really had some kind of concrete reason behind it, which in itself is a big Pet Sounds signpost.
Oh, hell yeah. And it's just mind-blowing to think that Don't Hurt My Little Sister, as intense as that song is, as personal as it is, that's from before Dance, Dance, Dance.
Yeah.
They recorded that before Brian, I think, even wrote Dance, Dance, Dance. It was before the Christmas album.
And, I was just going to say, that same week, they did a significant amount of work on the Christmas album.
Yep.
As well as a session for Little Honda. So other stuff was happening at that time that was kind of on the more lighthearted pop side, where this undercurrent of things that were more serious, things more like that Brian had to get out, was starting to come up.
Oh, yeah. And I think we can safely skip over all the rest of June, because there's a lot of stuff going on in June, but skip over, I think, to something really important that you actually told me, make sure that this is in here. July 4th. What was significant about that day? Well,
July 4th, 1964 was the day that I Get Around hit number one. The Beach Boys' first number one hit.
Mm-hmm.
And what I feel is quite significant about it is that they hit number one in the summer of Beatlemania, at a time when there were Beatles records all over the charts. A Hard Day's Night was coming out. The Beatles were getting ready they had already done some concerts here in the United States. They were preparing to come back later in the summer or in early fall. Everybody was going crazy over the Beatles. Even Was it Lauren Green had a number one hit with a song like a Western-themed song.
It was one of those talking things.
Called Ringo.
He lay face down on the desert sand, clutching his 6-gun in his hand. Shot from behind, I thought he was dead, for under his heart was an...
It had nothing to do with Ringo Starr.
Yeah,
but yet everybody goes bananas and buys this record.
Well, the thing is, it was already old at the time. It came out a year or two before, but once this group with the drummer called Ringo came out, they're like, let's see if we can capitalize on this.
I mean, that was smart.
Very brilliant.
But, I mean, nothing against Lauren Green,
no, of
but
course
I mean,
not.
It's just kind of funny. So here in the summer of 1964, on 4th of July. How beautiful is that?
And number one for 2 weeks, I believe.
That the Beach Boys hit number one. And I once, years ago, I actually did a little research on this. I think they were the only American band, not act. I'm excluding, singing groups or solo artists. I'm talking actual band, guitar, drums, bass.
Yep.
I think they were the only American band that came anywhere near the Beatles. That is huge.
Yeah, and right around that time, A Hard Day's Night was only a few weeks away in the theaters, too. So I think they came out with I Get Around at just the right time. Yeah. If they had waited a little bit longer, they might not have had that number one hit.
But it is well documented amongst the universe that you don't care for I Get Around, but even you can admit that song...
it deserved its number one hit
That song
status.
is nothing but hook.
It truly is.
I mean, if you were going to put out something to try to get it to number one, that was it. It's almost like a sampler of everything that Brian and the Beach Boys had to offer, that it had the harmonies, it had a driving beat. Yes, it's a car song, but it's also kind of a declaration of independence, like wanting to kind of break free from things, which I think was where Brian's head was at the time.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's just so much to it. I mean, I remember my father telling me, hearing that song when he first got home from the Navy, and it just blew his mind. And that's what kind of sealed the deal for him in terms of the Beach Boys. He's like, I got to check these guys out.
Oh, yeah. And when you look at the timeline of the Beach Boys, when I Get Around was number one, they were on day 2 of 22 straight days of concerts, 23 actually. In those 23 days, they did 32 concerts. They did not have a single day off. On July 4th, by the way, they were at the Honolulu International Center for the second night of a 2-night stay there.
Yeah, it is a grueling schedule where they did not have a day off for most of July.
Yeah.
Many dates, they played 2 shows in one day. Keep in mind that this was back long before what artists have today, where they have, if they're not traveling by air, they have the very comfortable, luxurious tour buses where you can actually get a good night's sleep, and you have places to put your stuff, and you have kitchenette, a table to sit at. I mean, it's probably not as great as a good hotel room or your own house, but it's certainly much more comfy than the accommodations that they probably had back then, which was like, what, a station wagon, maybe?
I think they would have upgraded from a station wagon back then.
Yeah, but I mean, they did
still,
not
you're at the mercy of a vehicle that, if it breaks down, you're screwed.
They did not have luxurious tour buses where you could actually, I mean, they were sleeping, leaning on each other in a back seat.
Oh, yeah.
And you could say, oh, those guys were young. And I mean, yeah, youth probably helped, but still...
Yeah, I mean, a couple of them were still teenagers.
Need a nice bed to sleep in, and so they were probably getting shut-eye on the road, not having any clue where they were.
Yeah, and jumping a little bit ahead just for a moment, when I was looking at this and I noticed, wait a minute, they don't have a single day off. I'm thinking, number one, I don't blame Brian for having a breakdown. And number two, I'm surprised he's the only one.
And you also keep in mind that they weren't just showing up in a city, playing a concert, and that's it. They still had to do I'm sure local media, radio station interviews or newspaper interviews, they had to meet the mayor's daughter or whoever.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they had to do publicity stuff. They had to do sound checks, and they had to find time to eat and shower and shave and use the bathroom. And I mean, their days were probably very full of all kinds of activities that probably got very repetitive. Because, I mean, how many mayor's daughters can you meet? How many DJs do you sit down with who ask you the same questions over and over?
Yeah. Yeah, which is why a lot of groups, including the Beach Boys, had these open-ended interview records that they shipped out to radio stations. They would actually take an existing interview, cut out the interviewer's questions, and send a script to the radio stations so that DJs could actually fake interview them. There's, I think, at least one Beach Boys open-ended interview floating around out there somewhere. So that kind of might have helped at some point. But going back to that grueling 23 straight days of 32 concerts, you mapped out where they went during those 23 days. It's just like, holy good grief.
Bouncing around. I mean, it wasn't like they were traveling in a straight line.
No.
They were going from, here to there to back through the same city multiple times. And yeah, I mean, that's...
They went from Hawaii to Arizona to New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa, back to Missouri, Kentucky, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, back to Wisconsin, specifically Madison, which is kind of in the middle of the state. And it takes a while to get from the border to Madison, then down to Chicago, and then back up to La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is way the heck up north in Wisconsin.
So when you really look at things, I mean, they had session time on June 30th. They did not see, Brian was not in a recording studio again until August 5th. And even still, they had, like on August 5th, they worked on When I Grew Up to Be a Man and She Knows Me Too Well. Now that's a day's work.
Yeah.
But that night, they had a concert in Burbank. So they did a pretty significant recording session and then still had to do a show.
Yeah, thank God it was just in Burbank, which is just down the street from Hollywood, really.
And then again on August 8th, they did some more work on She Knows Me Too Well. And then 2 concerts in San Diego.
San Diego is 100 miles south of L.A.
Yeah, it's like a 2.5 hour drive.
Yeah, I don't think they had a charter plane yet at that point.
I have to wonder if that whole stretch of time, having more than a month away from a recording studio, Brian must have been getting the shakes.
I know. And also in that time, on July 13th, this album that I'm holding up to the microphone so our listeners can see it, All Summer Long, came out. I brought visual aids just in case we needed some prompting here.
That's the Don't Break Down.
It's the Don't Break Down. Yeah, a quick way to tell if it's Don't Break Down is if the song list on the front is in a beige color. If it's black, it's Don't Back Down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't care what anybody says, Don't Break Down copies are not that hard to find.
No, they are not.
And I see the record rolled out of this thing.
Yeah, well, hey, it's
survived this long. It's survived,
a hardy record.
Yeah, it survived almost 60 years.
There's a lot of good stuff on that record.
And with photos taken in Malibu at Paradise Cove.
Ooh.
Yeah, with lots of models. None of them, I don't think any of these were their significant others. But
and keep in mind, there was a stretch of, what'd you say, 21 days without a break?
23.
Or 23 days. They still maybe only had a day or two off. It's not like they had a nice week off.
Yeah.
Because the concerts still went on until pretty much the beginning of, well into September. I'm scrolling through our lengthy document.
Yeah, and included in that is their 2 concerts they did in Sacramento, which became the basis for the Beach Boys concert album.
And then when you also consider that the All Summer Long record came out during this time.
Yep.
And the When I Grew Up to Be a Man, She Knows Me Too Well single came out on August 24th. They also had to do, not in addition to doing local publicity for their concerts, they probably also had to do some capital business to like nationwide promotions.
Capitol Records, we were saying.
Yeah, nationwide promotions for these releases.
And whatever else have you, and also have time to just stop and eat.
Yeah. To like,
I hope.
To like eat or see their wives and girlfriends, like maybe go to somebody's wedding or birthday party. I mean, just like have a life. Like in Mickey Dolenz's book, he talks about when the Monkees started and the crazy schedule that they had of doing the TV show, recording studios, publicity, all the things where, and Mickey tells a story of going to the shopping mall that he's gone to his whole life to do some Christmas shopping and nearly being killed by a stampede of girls who recognized him because he had been so busy that he had no idea that the show was popular, that the records were hits.
Yep.
Like he had no idea and had never dealt with this before in his life. So it's like he didn't even have time to process it all and enjoy it. Like to actually sit and enjoy the success.
Yep.
I mean, that's kind of sad, actually.
Yeah. All that they had to do while on the road, away from their comforts of home, and God knows what else. And I feel sorry for God for knowing what else. But one thing interesting that I noticed when we go into September, they were in Nashville on September 22nd, 1964. And they had, what was the schedule like in Nashville for that day? They had...
well, they had a concert that night.
Yes. Okay. At the Municipal Auditorium.
But during the day, they went into Columbia Records studio in Nashville to record Dance, Dance, Dance.
Yeah. It's not the single version that we all know and love, but it's the bonus track version from the twofer. Because Brian, apparently, if I understand correctly, Brian and Carl and possibly Mike had just written it. And Brian wanted to hurry up and get that thing down. So they went into a studio. Well, they booked 6 hours in the studio.
Well, like I said, Brian probably was having the shakes at that time.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I got to record something. I need to be behind a board.
Well, just a few days earlier, they recorded All Dressed Up for School.
Yeah. And
it sat unrelist until 1990.
Yeah, I was going to say, where did that go?
But yeah, in September, they had a full schedule too. They're all over the place. Looks like a lot of dates in the Northeast. They had New York, Massachusetts, and they went over to Utah after they recorded I'm So Young on September 9th. They're just bouncing all over the country.
Then they were down in the South.
Yeah.
Miami, Alabama.
Back east?
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Then Atlanta, Knoxville, and again, in the midst of that, another release, 4 by the Beach Boys.
Yep.
That EP came out, so they had to probably promote that as well.
Well, they already were doing Wendy and Don't Back Down and Hushabye. All 3 of those songs were on that EP. I don't remember the 4th one because in my notes I accidentally typed Wendy twice. But they were definitely already doing that in concert because they recorded that at the Sacramento show. And
here's an interesting date, September 23rd. They did a concert in Virginia at the Alexandria roller rink. So just the fact that the Beach Boys were doing a concert at a roller rink.
And they had a #1 hit with no end in sight to their string of hits.
Well,
and they're doing a roller rink.
Well, to be fair, keep in mind back then, a venue was a venue. I mean, they didn't really have cushy places to play. I mean, we've seen a bunch of like high school auditoriums and I mean, why not have a concert at a place where kids go?
That's true.
I mean, it probably was a good place to have a show, but it still is just funny to see that because you picture like...
And it's like they're right across the road from Washington, D.C. and they're playing a roller rink.
Again, it might have been, let's bring the music to the kids.
Could be.
But the fun fact, one of the other acts on this bill was the Mugwumps.
Who
became what?
They evolved into the Mamas and the Papas.
Yeah. Kind of interesting. So they played a roller rink too.
Yeah.
And then just 2 days after the roller rink, They were in New York City to rehearse for the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah, and that's after going to Providence. So they went way up north and then back down south a little bit. So yeah, Ed Sullivan Show, they rehearsed. The rehearsal was the 25th. They actually did the broadcast on the 27th. And I think that's the famous one when there's a close-up on Carl's fingers and he screws up the intro to Wendy.
And you know that...
The big moment, oh no!
And you know that while the whole time that they're performing, Carl is thinking, I'm going to die. Because he has an older brother who is much larger and more athletic than him.
And another older brother who will be all too happy to help.
So you know that Brian probably held him down and sat on his face and farted or something.
Yeah, and you're talking about how the Beach Boys would play anywhere. Well, between those two Sullivan dates, they went across the Hudson to West Orange, New Jersey. Not a far hike, really. And played at an armory.
Well, I mean, again, that's a big...
Probably for the military.
That's a big haul. Or, yeah, I mean, it could have been a military show, or that could have just been where they were booked. And I mean, let's make it clear. We're not making it sound like the Beach Boys were just playing any venue that they could get because they were desperate or something. I think this is what every band out there was doing. They were playing whatever venue they could get booked in because that's how you made your money, and that's how you brought music to the kids.
Yeah, and also, I don't remember if it was in Mike's book or somewhere else when Mike was talking about how back in their early days, they would play these really oddball places where people usually don't get to see rock and roll acts. Mm-hmm. And he said they kind of use that strategy again in more recent years, like starting in the late 90s.
Well, yeah.
Like the Balloon Festival in that weird place.
Yeah, in North Jersey. And I mean, it makes total sense.
Why not bring the music to these people who can't really get to a major city that much?
Or who don't have like a fancy highfalutin theater in their town. I mean, again, as long as you can set up your amps and plug stuff in, let's have a show.
Why not?
Also, I'm guessing that back then, there may not have been as many restrictions in regards to unions.
Yeah.
Where like nowadays you have to play a venue that has union technicians, or you have to have union technicians on hand. And there's probably a lot more regulations in terms of just to make sure that everything is up to code, that that you're not going to like cause a blackout in the city by plugging in a whole bunch of amps or something. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, they probably didn't have as much regulations and restrictions back then. So yeah, I mean, you could go into just any old place and carry your gear. Mm-hmm. So October was
really big, I think.
Well, it was big, but it wasn't as grueling.
Exactly.
Somebody must have like freaked out on them because they actually, or somebody forgot to schedule something because they gave them like some time off by accident.
Well, we keep saying, while they're going to where the kids are, well, where are the kids in October? They're in school.
Well, true, but
July, they're not in school.
So October started with, again, they probably did take some time off and slept for a solid week. Yeah. But then they started some heavier work. Dance, Dance, Dance on the 9th and Guess I'm Dumb on the 14th.
Yeah. Yeah. With Brian, Carl, the Honeys, and of course the Wrecking Crew and
Glenn Campbell.
Glenn Campbell, that's right. I knew there was somebody I was missing.
So then they had a bunch more shows. In the midst of that, Beach Boys concert was released.
Something just occurred. Okay, remind me when we get around to December that something occurred to me.
Okay.
But anyway, go on.
Well, we have Beach Boys concert came out that month, which went to number 1.
Yep.
And the Dance, Dance, Dance Warmth of the Sun single also came out that month.
And did not go to number 1.
No, but it did well. And then October ends with The Tammy Show.
Oh, yeah. Which is now out on DVD. Well, it's been out on DVD for a while.
Yeah.
Oh my! If you have not seen the whole Tammy Show, it's a hell of a show to watch. It really is.
Yeah. It's like the hosts are Jan and Dean.
Yep.
And they also kind of have the little theme song of the Tammy Show.
Yeah. What's it called? Like all over the world or something.
But it's got pretty stellar lineup. You've got the Rolling Stones, you've got James Brown.
James Brown's set kicked so many asses.
Oh my God.
Ooh.
I mean, you pretty much have everybody who's not the Beatles.
Yeah, and you had Leslie Gore in Santa Monica wearing what looked like this big winter coat.
I know, because she's so New Jersey. And I believe Terry Garr was one of the Go-Go dancers,
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, though, I felt bad for the people performing at that thing because the go-go dancers were getting up in everybody's faces. It's like, man, they should have just shoved them out of the way.
But yeah, that's a pretty awesome show. And the Beach Boys were one of the top acts, one of the headliners for it. So it was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I think what it was, they spent 2 days rehearsing, and the second day of rehearsal was also the first day of filming, and then there was another day of filming. Word got out as to what hotel the artists were staying at.
Oh, boy.
And, of course, what happens in 1964 when teenagers find out their idols, who are not the Beatles, but still their idols, are in town. They're going to find them out, so they ended up spending their second night over at the actual auditorium instead of the hotel.
Oh, man.
Just to keep away from everybody.
And then right on the heels of that, they have to fly to London to kick off their European tour.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and the flight was October 31st, which was a Saturday. And the flight had to be diverted to Shannon Airport in Ireland because of fog. And while they were waiting for their flight to resume to London, they bump into a guy named Brian Epstein.
Yep.
Or as some people say, Epstein, but whoever, but they chatted with him for a little bit. I don't know if anything significant happened as a result or if they got any fancy knowledge or whatever, but the fact is they crossed paths and met and talked in a transit lounge.
And I do love this note we have here that on November 1st, they arrived in London to a Beatles-like reception.
Yeah.
I love that they were heartily greeted by British fans. Because remember, the Beach Boys were a fairly new thing in the UK. The records didn't come out at the same time that they came out here in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
So 64 is really when the interest really started for the Beach Boys. And it's almost a different timeline that the what we consider the later records came out first, and the surf records didn't come out until sometime later.
Yeah. Not much later, but later enough that to us Americans and how we know of how their music evolved, that was a world of difference probably. But the fact is the English people liked it.
Pretty much their first bunch of days in the UK was a lot of television appearances were filmed for both the UK and for Paris. And then they started performing concerts.
And while they were there, they recorded some songs for BBC Radio, which have since been released. I think a couple of them made it to the Made in California archival release, and a couple of more were on, I believe, one of the 1964 copyright extension releases. I don't know which one off the top of my head. That's the thing about these copyright extensions. There's so many of them. Like, there are some years when there were multiple ones, and it's hard to keep track of which one's on which. Good Lord. That's a good problem to have if you're a fan, I gotta say.
Yeah, an embarrassment of riches.
Yep. And of course, while they were in England, there was also yet another album release. This was, let's see, their fourth album from 1964, right here, the Beach Boys Christmas album.
And the Man with All the Toys single came out on November 9th.
That was both the same day, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Brian was hoping to have another Little Saint Nick. It was not quite as successful. I think it was a little bit of a hit. But what's that you discovered? What might have been a possible, or what was definitely an influence for part of The Man with All the Toys?
I suddenly forgot the name of it.
It was a single released on Atco Records by Nino Temporal and April Stevens.
Yeah.
Or is it Nino Stevens?
Yeah.
Okay.
But what was the title?
Deep Purple.
Okay. Not the band Deep Purple.
Yeah.
But a song called Deep Purple. Listen to it, because near the end, they do the...
Well, you know what? We can drop a few seconds of it here and get away with it.
They do the up... the same.
The thing that I hate about that song.
Because I first heard that on the Sirius XM 60s channel, and I'm like, oh my God, this and it's like the timing. I mean, because that song came out sometime in 1963.
Yep.
So Brian definitely would have heard it.
And we know he heard it because he also recorded it for Adult Child. So a more, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically in a version that Murray Wilson would like, with Dick Reynolds strings and everything.
So they came back and did more concerts, more work. And then in the middle of all of this, on December 7th.
Oh, yes.
Brian and Marilyn got married.
Yes.
So in the midst of all this craziness.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to link this in the show notes if I can find it again, but there was an article from, I believe, a Houston newspaper detailing that tumultuous fall and the early winter that Brian had. And the story was that, according to the guy they were talking to, was when the Beach Boys were on their way to Australia in November, Brian had the pilot radio down and have Marilyn called and told her, Brian wants you to wait by the phone because he's going to call you when he lands. And at that point, when they landed, he called her and proposed. Of course, the problem with that is the Beach Boys did not go to Australia in November. They went in January, right after they recorded Fun, Fun, Fun. So it might have been before they left for England, or it might have been that Brian and Marilyn had been engaged for that long. That much I don't know.
And see, it's interesting because we really spent some time talking about this and even asking a couple people who know a lot more than we do.
Mm-hmm.
And for all the books that we've read, the documentaries, all the material we've absorbed over many, many years of fandom, we've never seen any real information about Brian and Marilyn's wedding.
Yeah.
Like, we have no idea where it happened, if they went to the courthouse.
I'm guessing that's what they did.
Somebody came to the house, to like Marilyn's house, and they had a little something in the backyard. There has never been a photo, any photo.
Published, at least.
We have no idea. I mean, we don't even know for sure if they were even actually engaged, like if Brian gave her a ring. And it's just kind of crazy and interesting that even just recently in Endless Summer Quarterly, there was a whole article that gave a lot of information about Carl's marriage to Annie Hinchy, like some pictures and some information like that. I mean, we don't even know if was Carl or Dennis Brian's best man. Like
I think it's generally agreed that Carl was,
but we have no idea. And it's just, there's so many other things that have been found out, researched, talked about, and nothing has ever come to the surface about this.
Yeah.
I find that, I mean, yeah, you could say, well, it's none of your business, but
of course not. Yeah.
But
it's still curious, you know?
It's just because Brian marrying Marilyn was, I think, a key part of this whole timeline. I mean, it's just a little weird that, because even in there are some people who say, oh, here's a picture from their wedding. No, it was
from a friend's wedding.
It was it was
or another relative or something.
Because Brian was in a suit or a tuxedo. Marilyn's really dressed up, but she was probably a bridesmaid.
Yeah, and the only thing that we've heard documented, and God knows how accurate it was Brian was in a hurry to marry Marilyn, especially after he thought he saw Mike kind of flirting with her, or she was flirting with Mike or something. One story I heard was that they did that just as a little joke to kind of bring Brian out of a little slump or something, which of course would not have been a good idea, I don't think.
Or it just may have been something totally innocent and playful,
and might have been misinterpreted.
Brian totally took it the wrong way. But again, there are so many other episodes in the Beach Boys canon that we found out later is not stories that get repeated over and over. We find out it's not quite like that.
Yeah. One other thing that I was able to find out is apparently December 7th was not the original time they were going to get married. Apparently Brian and Marilyn had gone to get married a day or two earlier, but for God knows what reason, Brian never thought to bring any kind of legal ID with him. So he had to go home, make sure he had his driver's license or something.
Yeah. Huh.
And that's why it happened on December 7th and not, say, December 5th or 6th. So, wow, on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day.
Huh.
Wow.
So then we get into later December. Okay, now that we're in December, what's the thing that you...
We'll get to that a little bit later in December.
okay.
But December wasn't really terribly busy at first. It was just a couple of appearances here and there. But things start to get a little bit interesting. December 16th, they recorded Kiss Me Baby for the Beach Boys Today, which Brian had written in Copenhagen sometime between November 22nd and 24th. I'm not able to pin down a more exact date if anybody knows for sure. Listen to our announcements at the end of the show for ways to contact us or reach out to us on Facebook or whatever. December 18th was a Bob Hope comedy special recorded in Burbank, of course, for NBC. And this is when things start to take a little bit of a turn. There was a concert scheduled for Assembly Center in Tulsa on the 19th, and then another one scheduled for Little Rock, Arkansas. Both of those concerts ended up being canceled due to an ill band member. We don't know who that band member was. We can only guess who it was. But moving forward, they fly from Little Rock to Houston on December 21st. And that was Carl's 18th birthday.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, despite popular report that this all happened on December 23rd, new evidence has come to light in the last couple of years that it actually happened on December 21st, when in the flight, the big breakdown incident, the panic attack, the anxiety attack, whatever you want to call it. Some people say, well, it wasn't a breakdown, it was a panic, whatever. Brian had an episode that was pretty disturbing.
Yeah. I have to wonder if it was a genuine, real panic attack, like a real mental episode, or did Brian put on an act?
I think I'm the one who put that in your head, did I not?
I don't know. I don't know if that was just something.
I have all kinds of controversial theories.
I mean, you have to wonder if Brian, especially when you look back at the kind of schedule that they had and how recording studio time had to be fit in here, there, and everywhere. If Brian maybe staged something, like figured I have to do something big. I mean, because we don't know if Brian had maybe been thinking about this. If Brian had kind of floated the idea like, hey guys, can we schedule things so that I have more time at home in the recording studio? No, we have to do this. I mean, we don't know. And Brian may have been kind of almost at the point of desperation and figured, okay, if I can stage a meltdown, that might make people sit up and take notice and take me seriously. I have to wonder.
I have to wonder too, especially because that whole time that Brian was with the guys in 1964 and late 63, he didn't want to be there. The only reason he was there was because of the famous, I hate you, Murray, I quit incident. Because of David Marks, he had to go back out on the road because whom else did they have? Mm-hmm. I'll bet you anything, Brian spent a lot of that time telling people, look, find someone else to play bass for you and to sing my parts.
Yeah. And he maybe thought, okay, if I do something big and if I am unable, then maybe they will do this.
Yeah.
I mean, if that was Brian's plan, dude, it worked.
Yeah. But really, after researching this episode and this podcast episode, and just seeing how grueling their schedules were, I'm starting to think, I don't think he did stage it. I think that was real, especially because apparently it was not the first time he had a panic attack. I think that was the first time it was really as big as it was.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know.
It could be, but whatever the case was, that same article I mentioned before, again, I'll try to link it on our show notes. The person they talked to, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. He said that Brian played that night in Houston. He said he would never know anything was wrong. But Brian backstage, you could tell something was not quite right with him. Like he was just kind of gazing off into space and kind of not interacting with anybody and just kind of looking not quite right.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we all know that Ron Swallow, I think it was the next day Ron Swallow flew back with Brian to LA and then flew to Dallas with Glenn Campbell, who filled in with him.
Yeah.
For Brian, I mean. Oh, and by the way, people listening to us right now, make sure you're sitting down right now, especially if you're a really big diehard Brianista. Sit down. Okay, you're sitting? Good. Okay. What was the name of the venue that they were playing at the night of the famous nervous breakdown?
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
The Music Hall.
A costly bow.
The Music Hall is lost for now.
Oh, God. Oh, goodness.
Oh, man. Yeah, this is why we do this work, people.
Yeah.
Because that just made us, that ended our night right there.
Yeah. But seriously, the generally agreed upon story was that it was Houston one night, Dallas the next. If it were December 23rd, as widely reported, going back to at least Heroes and Villains, the book by Stephen Gaines, that would have meant that the Dallas show was Christmas Eve.
Which would not have happened.
It would not have happened. And especially because recently, people have produced ticket stubs advertising December 22nd as the Dallas concert date. And what I find weird is that nobody said, oh yeah, I remember that well. That was Carl's 18th birthday.
Yeah.
And apparently Mike had no idea what was going on because he thinks he was sitting in a different part of the plane. He didn't know until I think after they landed that Brian had this freak out. And that brings me to this. The widely told story is that Brian recorded Guess I'm Dumb for Glenn Campbell as a thank you for filling in for him.
When, of course, that was several months before.
Which brings me to this. I'm jumping way ahead. That was only the backing track they recorded.
Oh, true.
So it could have been that Brian recorded that for later use and then later on decided, hey, Glenn, can you sing this?
True. Glenn Campbell may have not even been a consideration. Yeah. That may have been like a Beach Boys track. Ha.
So yeah, December 22nd was the first show with Glenn Campbell.
So then they did a couple more shows over the time right after Christmas and into 65.
Yeah.
And around this time, Brian probably sat down with the guys and said, look, I need to take a break from the road. I need to stay in the studio.
Well, yeah, which is exactly what happened because Glenn Campbell was playing dates for quite a while then.
So then we see, starting January 7th, a whole bunch of prolific things start happening.
Good
because
grief.
Brian was at home. Brian was where he wanted to be. And he knocked out Please Let Me Wonder, Help Me Rhonda, Do You Want to Dance, Good to My Baby.
The original Help Me Rhonda, that is.
In the Back of My Mind.
Well, of course, the Beach Boys were there too because there were no tour dates or anything.
Well, yeah, but still, it's like Brian could get down to work. He didn't have to just get a bunch of sessions done knowing he had to get back out on the road in a couple days. And then
there's one thing that I added to our notes that I wanted to mention
before.
Yeah, there's one reason I'm putting this here, and it's really just Beach Boys myth busting. Anybody who saw I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, the documentary about Brian from 1995, there was a talking head with David Crosby and Graham Nash, and Graham Nash was talking about how Andrew Loog Oldham, the Rolling Stones manager, put out a full-page ad proclaiming the greatness of Pet Sounds. Well, Andrew Doe, who is the author of a couple of Beach Boys books, and he knows his stuff. He researches, he talks to the right people. He was asked to find that ad for the Pet Sounds sessions that came out in 1996. He couldn't find it. And the reason he couldn't find it, it never happened. What the ad was Andrew Loog Oldham proclaiming the greatness of the Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Loving Feeling. A big theory about that is because the Righteous Brothers and Cilla Black's versions both came out at roughly the same time, and supposedly Andrew Loog Oldham, or is it Logue? Because I know M-O-O-G is Moog. But anyway, he apparently had this vendetta against Brian Epstein, and Cilla Black was one of Brian Epstein's acts, so he was trying to make sure that the Righteous Brothers had the bigger hit. And they did. I think Cilla Black's only went to number 2 in England, Righteous Brothers went to number 1. There was no such ad for Pet Sounds. It was for You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling by the Righteous Brothers. So that came out in a magazine with the issue date of January 16th. Now, it's not necessarily the same day that it was released. It was just the issue date. And so putting that out there for all to hear. And that was published in Record Mirror, and it was not a full page ad. It was only a quarter of a page ad. Anyway.
The Beach Boys headed back out on the road, and there were some dates with Brian.
Yeah.
But he wasn't at all the dates. He probably just flew out, joined with them for a couple dates. I'm assuming these were dates Glenn Campbell wasn't available.
I think that's exactly what the case was.
So that was probably still something Brian could deal with.
Yeah, and that was all in the Northeast United States, like New Jersey, Rhode Island, and places like that.
And then also, like in March, the Erie Crown Theater in Chicago.
Yeah.
Brian was at those shows.
And there's a reason for that. It's because there are 3 shows that Brian did in March, and that was the 2 at the Erie Crown Theater, and there was another one in Cincinnati. The reason that Brian was there was because they were recording those concerts for possible release. Now, by that time, Bruce Johnston had started to join the group, but he could not be on the recordings because it would be a conflict of interest with his contract with, I think, Columbia. So he couldn't be on any other recordings until his contract lapsed. So Brian had to come out and do those concerts. Now, I don't know if the Cincinnati concert exists anywhere. I'm guessing it was lost somewhere. But the 2 Chicago concerts at the Erie Crown Theater, that is available. That was in the 2015 copyright extension release. And I gotta say, if they really were serious about putting that out as a concert album, they would have had a lot of overdub sessions and stuff, because there were so many flaws in that. Some balance problems. There are a lot of vocals missing. Brian forgot half the lyrics of "Don't Worry, Baby" at the first show.
Well, what are the words? Oh, what she does to me. I wrote the song too.
And I'm just going to show Lisa what McCormick Place looked like at the time.
Yeah.
Yep, because about 2 years after they performed there, McCormick Place burned down, and they had to rebuild it a few years later. And what was interesting, if you listen to those McCormick Place shows, you hear Mike talk about how a friend of theirs who moved to L.A. from Chicago was working with them, named Terry Sachin. And he always talks about how cool Chicago is, how tough Chicago is. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting. And we all know, of course, Terry Sachin for I Know There's an Answer. He rewrote the Hang On to Your Ego lyrics. He was one of the road managers. Thought that was fascinating.
So we go through early 65. We have Do You Want to Dance came out on February 15th, backed with Please Let Me Wonder. And then the Beach Boys Today album came out on March 8th.
And I know you wanted to spend some time talking about this.
The world's worst album cover. Like, whoever is the graphic artist who put together the Beach Boys Today cover needs to be taken outside and beaten with a rake. Because, first of all, they didn't even do a new photo shoot. It was the same photo shoot. It was from the same shoot that they did for the Christmas album, because they're wearing the same sweaters.
Actually, no, they're not.
Oh, they aren't?
Well, no, not. Because look at that. They're wearing different colored sweaters.
Okay, well, they're still wearing freaking sweaters. When you think Beach Boys, do you think sweaters? No.
And there was what looks like a ladder going into a pool.
Yes, they were probably sitting on a diving board.
Yeah. And also, just typical of American album releases, these are album covers are meant to be advertisements in America. So they're the Beach Boys Today, and it lists the songs, plus 3 more great new songs written by Brian Wilson.
Yeah, the 3 songs not listed are...
I have to look at it, and I don't want to waste too many times, but 2 of those songs, great new songs written by Brian Wilson,
weren't written by Brian.
One was Bull Session with the Big Daddy, which is not a song.
Yeah.
And it's written by everybody participating.
It's more like a improvised thing. It's not really written.
And another one of those 3 great new songs written by Brian Wilson, I'm So Young, a cover that Brian had nothing to do with writing.
And then you have like this brown band across the bottom. It's like, it's just so horrible.
It's like, what? Yeah, there's this big brown emptiness below their torsos. Like, what were they doing that you couldn't show the rest of them?
And that they had to like crop the picture like that.
Yeah, and the sun's obviously in their eyes because they're squinting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, really terrible.
Yeah, and basically it's one reason some people say that Beach Boys album covers are inversely proportional to the quality of
Well,
the
yeah,
music.
I mean, you look at Summer in Paradise, that's a beautiful album cover.
MIU album too, with a big wave.
Yeah, that's beautiful artwork, but the album sucks. So during this time, Brian's really getting into some heavy stuff because Let 'Em Run Wild is being worked on, the other version of Help Me Rhonda, Salt Lake City, in between concerts that Brian had to run out to. But if you look at the schedule, it's far more forgiving. It's not as many shows in a row. They have some TV appearances in there. I mean, it's nowhere near as horrible.
Something just occurred to me.
What?
Bruce's first show with the Beach Boys was April 9th, which was after the Airy Crown Chicago concert. So Brian didn't fly out because of Bruce sticking to his contract with Columbia, because that wasn't an issue. So that's
that
another
might have
mystery.
been a Glenn Campbell thing.
I don't know.
And then we start to see in the schedule too, where there's a concert someplace, but also recording going on. So Brian was back home, like say, for instance, April 14th. The Beach Boys were in Fort Lauderdale while Brian was doing the backing track of Amusement Parks USA.
Yep.
Time well spent.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, why don't you talk about what you discovered about April 25th?
April 25th. Oh, yeah. There was a concert scheduled, and I believe tickets were sold for a Beach Boys concert on April 25th at Carnegie Hall at Kansas State College in Pittsburgh, Kansas. The day before, they were at the Washington Coliseum. You really think they're going to go all the way to Kansas from Washington, D.C., for one thing? No, because they had no idea that somebody had booked them at that venue. I don't remember the name of the person, but it's in the book, The Beach Boys in Concert, co-written by Ian Rustin and John Stebbins, talks a little bit about that. And I got a little bit more information from Andrew Doe's Bellagio10452.com, in which the person who booked the show was a known shyster. It was basically a take the money and run kind of thing. That's the long story brought down really short. There's more to it than that. But the fact is the Beach Boys didn't show up because they had no idea about it. Fun stuff, huh?
Very, very fun.
But that was pretty much how April ended for the Beach Boys, aside from Girl Don't Tell Me being recorded on April 30th, which was all Beach Boys. No, I don't think there was any Wrecking Crew. If there was Wrecking Crew, it was maybe... I don't remember off the top of my head. It was just like percussion or something. Maybe Ron Swallow. I'm not sure.
But then going into May, you have, again, a lot more dates where the Beach Boys were in one place and Brian was in another.
May 7th.
Making some very, very wonderful music.
Yeah, You're So Good to Me was recorded on May 7th while the Beach Boys were performing in Birmingham, Alabama. Bruce couldn't make that date, so Glenn Campbell filled in for them. In fact, Glenn was with them for several... Actually, yeah, Glenn Campbell is in for Bruce for several of those dates for whatever reason.
And then May 29th, the Beach Boys had their second number one hit, Help Me Rhonda.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and on May 16th, by the way, they were scheduled to appear on The Sullivan Show, but they got bumped. And they said, let's reschedule. We know that next time...
They were rescheduled for, 1968?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you guys come back in 3 years?
But yeah, Help Me Rhonda went to number one for 2 weeks, and the Beach Boys, that same day that Help Me Rhonda went to number one, they were at the Lagoon in Farmington, Utah, doing 2 concerts. The Lagoon, of course, being mentioned in Salt Lake City. I hope they performed Salt Lake City there.
Yeah, right. That would be kind of stupid if they didn't.
Yeah, right. Which tells me they probably didn't.
And then there's not much in June. They must have...
Oh, I disagree. June 4th?
Well, okay, I mean, there's only a couple dates that we found activity for in June.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
No, June 4th was the vocal overdubs for California Girls. Of course, that was important.
Which I believe was their 8-track tape debut. By 8-track tape, I mean a tape that has 8 individual recording channels, and I don't mean the 8-track cartridge that was big in the 70s.
So then, Summer Days, Summer Nights album came out on July 5th, which was less than 4 months since their previous album.
Yeah. And we have a nice cover here. Who's missing, of course, the lead singer of the number one hit from the album.
Yeah, like they couldn't wait for Al.
And there's Carl holding a cigarette.
Yeah.
Actually, I think there are some copies in which the picture's chopped in that place, so you can't really tell. But on this copy I have, which was actually pressed in Canada, it's pretty clear. I think the record was pressed in Scranton, but it was actually distributed in Canada. But yeah, we got Carl, Dennis, Brian, and Mike. And Bruce is on the boat, but he's not in the picture, again, because he couldn't yet be photographed with the group.
It's like, I mean, kind of think about this. Like, I mean, I understand with, being under other contracts. Of course, there were reasons why Bruce could not be photographed or be credited with things, but it's almost like for a couple months, like they had to just throw a blanket over him or something.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he's loud and clear at the end of California Girls.
Wish they all could be California.
Or like lock him in a bathroom until everybody else left.
Yeah.
It's like, we can't speak of Bruce.
Yeah.
Or he had to go hide.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like doorbell rings and it's Bruce and they have to slam the door in his face.
All right, now here's the question I have for you. A week later, California Girls was released, which should have been a #1 hit. Now, do we know what kept California Girls from being a #1 hit?
I know I've looked it up and it was something worthwhile. It wasn't
better than California Girls. Come on.
No, I mean,
as much as I love the Beatles, even the Beatles' best stuff in that time was not better than California Girls.
But yeah, we have July 12th was a big day because you have the California Girls Let 'Em Run Wild single released. They did a concert in Raleigh, and now here is the beginning of Pet Sounds.
The true beginning.
Because that was the day that the Sloop John B backing track was recorded.
Yep.
So on the same day that a single where both sides were also major Pet Sound signposts. Yeah. So it's kind of like mark that date.
Yeah. In fact, I took an informal poll on our Facebook group. What's your favorite song from 1965 by the Beach Boys? I think it was Bill McAvoy, I think. If I got that wrong and it was somebody else, I apologize. Said, even though it's technically from Pet Sounds, because the backing track was recorded in 1965, I'm going to say Sloop John B. And I kind of thought somebody would go that route. Because, man, this was the beginning of something huge artistically.
And something that we forgot to mention because it wasn't in the notes, and I just remembered it now, but we'll say it since we're talking about the release of California Girls. Something that happened that made that song possible back early, probably sometime in March, was when Brian had his first experience with LSD.
Yep.
Which Brian himself has said that during that trip, he was thinking about Western things.
Yep.
And kind of bum-ba-dee-da-dum-ba-dee-da. And that was in his head. And that was the genesis of what became California Girls.
And of course, we all know the story about how... Actually, let me see. When did they record the backing track of that?
Like in April, I think.
In April? Oh, if only there were a way to search for the phrase California Girls on an electronic document.
Yeah, April 6th.
April 6th? Okay.
Yeah.
So April 6th, 1965. Let me check something here.
So that's why I said sometime in March. May have been when he had that first LSD trip.
Okay, yeah. The reason I was asking is because according to Mike, while Brian was recording the backing track, Mike was out in the hallway of the studio writing down words for the song. And given that the day before they were doing a show in Anaheim, that's totally plausible. That's very, very believable. 44 takes they had to do. And here's the thing. They had 14 musicians, including Carl, on that recording. You have 14 people. That's 14 possibilities to make a mistake at any point.
Well,
so,
and
yeah.
Also, I mean, here is my guess. If this was music that was inspired by a psychedelic experience, Brian had something extremely specific in his head that he probably could not put down on paper. It was probably more like he needed to have it recorded, like he needed to actually have the musicians do it in order for him to say, this is right or this is wrong. Like he probably needed those takes to translate what he heard in his head. And I mean, I think this is just probably a lot of how Brian always worked, but because of the psychedelic part may have complicated things. where he had something very, very specific and needed to get it down.
Mm-hmm.
That's my guess.
Well, the outtakes are there for the listening. There were a lot of mistakes being made.
Well, that too. Well, but were they mistakes or were they Brian not effectively?
No, they were clearly.
Oh, okay.
They were clearly mistakes.
But do you get what I'm saying, though? That
like, and people playing out a rhythm and
Brian
things.
may not have barely been effectively communicating either, because it may have been hard for him to really articulate it in a way that people would understand.
But don't lose the beat on the drums was hard to understand. Like, don't accidentally hit the wrong drum in this wrong place was hard to understand.
Fine. Okay, fine.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that, believe me, a lot of those were legitimate musical mistakes. Performance mistakes.
So then in the end of August?
Even before then, the end of July.
What?
July 29th, Dennis married Carol Friedman, pardon me. And the reason I'm mentioning this, you might think, okay, yeah, so Dennis had his first of 5 marriages, but the thing is, it just shows you what was going on in the lives of these young men, because in addition to going out on the road, having to record, having to tour, having to promote themselves, go on TV, go on the radio, eat, sleep, and all this, other things going on, like they're getting married. Brian got married in the midst of all the craziness. Now it's Dennis's turn. And upon getting married, he was also a father because he adopted Scott Friedman. I can't say their names.
And the following year, I mean, Carl got married in 66.
Yep.
Mike's second marriage, I believe, was in 66.
Or 67, one of those years,
yeah. But starting in the end of August was work on the Party album.
Yep.
No rest for the weary in the studio.
And which brings me another point, is that at that point, Dennis was in the process of buying a house, too. We know that because he talks about it during the sessions. And I'm not sure if it's the 2600 Benedict Canyon house that he did move into. And that's crazy when you think about it. He was 20 years old and he was buying a house.
Well, he was a 20-year-old, very wealthy person.
Well, but still, it's like, man.
All this running around on the road was paying off because they had hit records and they were making money on royalties and their concerts and all this stuff. So
he couldn't even vote yet, and he was buying a house. For his wife and his
it's like
child.
I don't know if you saw this, but I saw an article a couple of years ago about how Eve Plum had just sold a little Malibu beach house that she had purchased in like 1970 or 71 when she was like 12, I think, 11 or 12, but with Brady Bunch money, she could afford to buy, it was like a pretty small, your traditional little Malibu beach cottage, not one of these palatial things, but more like the kind of house that most people in Malibu had and probably still have. So it may have been just kind of like her family's weekend home or something, but she was a little kid, but she could afford to buy a house because she was on a TV show and making a lot of money.
Yep.
So yeah, age has nothing to do with it.
Still, when I was 20 years old, I was living with my parents.
Yeah, you weren't in a popular rock band that was giving the Beatles a run for their money. So
no, I was a junior in college.
Anyway, they got into recording the Party album, which, as we know, was kind of a really different concept. I mean, Capitol was pressuring Brian to put out a release to sell well at Christmas, just like they had the previous year. So they came up with this kind of crazy idea to have something that was made to sound like it was pretty much like a jam session, but
and I think it succeeds in that regard.
Well, yeah, and especially because they did jam on some stuff in between.
Yeah. What did I say recently off microphone?
Yeah.
About how I see it as this is their equivalent to the Beatles Get Back sessions, because they came into the party sessions with specific songs in mind that they were going to be doing, and they also did kind of off stuff that was clearly unrehearsed, like Ticket to Ride. And you could even hear Al or Carl playing Help in the background in a couple of places. But meanwhile, you had stuff that they were clearly rehearsed on, like Smokey Joe's Cafe, Mountain of Love, which they did many takes of, Alley Oop, Hully Gully. I Can't Get No Satisfaction was planned. It was obviously planned because they were nailing it. Of course, not everything ended up being released back then. It's released now. You can get it on what was it? Beach Boys Party Unplugged, Unmixed, or whatever they call it.
And the thing that always kind of got me about this was the fact that they basically made fun of two of their own songs.
Yes.
I Get Around and Little Deuce Coupe.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I've read somewhere kind of some praise for that in 1965, most rock and roll bands took themselves way too seriously to do something like that. Or they didn't feel like they could do something like that, like goof on themselves. What was the exception?
The Beatles.
The Beatles.
And the Beach Boys.
The Beatles' 1965 Christmas record.
Yep, the Beatles' third Christmas record, I think, was the official title of it.
And this is total coincidence, because there's no
absolutely.
way the Beach Boys would have been aware of, because, these records only went to fan club members.
And America didn't even get most of them because by the time they arrived, later.
So it's not like they would have had any knowledge of this, but the 1965 Beatles Christmas record in particular, I think they may have had some influential substances in their midst.
It's just a remote possibility.
But they were they were kind of making up other words to yesterday and
yesterday. All my troubles seem so far away.
So it's like, the Beatles felt comfortable enough to goof on themselves, and the Beach Boys kind of did too. So I think that's significant.
And if you listen to the sessions, which thankfully you can legally now, you don't have to get the Sea of Tunes set to hear this, I don't think. You can actually hear Carl and Mike both say, I don't think we should be doing I Get Around. And I think Mike brings up the point that they had already released I Get Around on 2 previous albums. And Brian said, well, I understand what you're saying, but I want to do it in kind of a weird way, a kind of a goofy way. Like if we do it real slow or some other way, just to kind of cool down off it or something.
Yeah.
That was his concept. He wanted to do something kind of offbeat like that. But there's a lot going on in those party sessions. If you listen to them, that tells you a lot of stories, again, about Dennis getting a house. There's one point where Carl's talking about the sun rays, and he says something like, oh man, I heard, I'm so happy for them. Around that time is when Carl set up the sun rays with Murray to work with. And apparently, things were starting to happen for them. Of course, they weren't a huge hit, but at least they were getting off the ground. And Carl was glad to know that something he was able to do for them was doing something. We have our first instance of Billy Hinsche on a recording, because he played harmonica on Mountain of Love. Dennis played harmonica on a couple of songs too. So there's a lot going on in that silly little album.
So then in October, we didn't see any concerts, but there was more recordings, such as The Little Girl I Once Knew, some other tracks that were unreleased for a long time. And then on October 14th, there was a backing track called, it was labeled Untitled.
Yeah.
Then it was In My Childhood.
Uh-huh.
Which then became You Still Believe in Me. So another Pet Sounds Genesis moment.
Yeah.
But then on October 22nd and 23rd, we had the filming of 2 pretty significant television appearances.
Yes.
Because you had the Andy Williams Show, which I find significant because of their performance of Their Hearts Were Full of Spring.
Yes.
It's easily findable on YouTube.
And it's in the Beach Boys, an American band.
Yeah, that too. But what I love about it is Brian looks so damn happy.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, this is his moment. This is his element. And they sound so good.
Mm-hmm.
They nail that beautifully. And then the next day, the Jack Benny Show.
The Jack Benny Hour.
Oh, the Jack Benny Hour.
Jack Benny Show was a TV
right.
series that had just been canceled. The Jack Benny Hour.
Okay.
The Jack Benny Hour was a TV special.
They did several TV specials, and
Pardon me, Jack Benny Program was the name of the TV series.
Yeah.
Jack Benny Hour was this TV special.
Okay, fine.
So anyway, go ahead.
So this is the sketch that we all know and love, where the Beach Boys are singing California Girls, and then Jack Benny and Bob Hope show up as two very, very
middle-aged
ho-dads.
And by the way, if the version you're familiar with is the one from An American Band, you're missing about half of it. They cut a lot
there's
out.
a lot that was cut out, but it just kind of shows that the Beach Boys couldn't act.
No.
You really turn on, man.
And also, Brian may have, as they say, herbed up.
He may have,
Because
yeah.
he's kind of talking like out of his ear practically.
And he's looking at no one in particular when he talks.
Yeah. I mean, the only one who really says lines with anything is Mike.
Yeah.
Mike does a good job, but the rest of them, nope. It's like, stick to singing, boys.
Yeah, and later on in that program, they cut back to the Beach Boys, who did a live version of Barbara Ann, which I found particularly interesting because, number one, that hadn't been out as a single yet.
Yeah.
And number two, their most recent album, Beach Boys Party, when was that released?
Party was released on November 8th, which was 5 days after the Jack Benny Hour aired.
And the thing is, There's No Other Like My Baby had been released or was about to be released as a B-side. So it's interesting that they chose what was at that point only going to be an album track to perform at the very end of the special.
Yeah.
And something that I had read was that the reason that Capitol put that out as a single, Barbara Ann, was that radio DJs were playing it. But the thing is, unless they had preview copies of the album at this point, they wouldn't have even had the album to play it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to how that came about. Or if they had already been told, look, we're going to put Barbara Ann out as a single, so start plugging it.
Could be.
Could be. I don't know.
But before we get to the Party album release, we had a session on October 24th for The Little Girl I Once Knew.
Yep.
And then on November 1st, Trombone Dixie.
Mm-hmm.
Was it called Trombone Dixie, or was that a name given to it later?
No, I don't know when that name was applied to it. I just seem to remember that in the liner notes for the 1990 Pet Sounds CD, it says that the phrase Trombone Dixie was written on the tape box.
Okay. So that may have been the working title of it. But Beach Boys Party came out November 8th.
Yeah, and before that happened is when the Jack Benny Hour aired, as
Yeah.
you said. And I put this in the notes for a reason. It was sponsored by Eastern Airlines. And what recently came about on YouTube, somebody found an Eastern Airlines commercial from 1971 that has about 3 seconds of the Beach Boys in Brian's home studio in the middle of a session. You can see Brian off in the corner, and Bruce says a quick one-liner. I don't remember what he said, but it's on YouTube. I'll link it.
I think it's free out here and makes the Beach Boys sing about being free.
Interesting.
So that's kind of why I put that on there. It was like kind of predicting there what was about to happen. And interestingly, the Jack Benny Hour preempted Bob Hope Presents the Chrysler Theater. So people who were disappointed not to see Bob Hope ended up seeing Bob Hope anyway.
See Bob Hope anyway. And then another Pet Sounds moment on November 17th, the track Run James Run, which later became Pet Sounds, was recorded.
It was called Run James Run because it was supposed to be James Bond music. I know there was a video, some James Bond YouTube channel. Somebody posted a video of James Bond themes that never happened. He had Run James Run / Pet Sounds as the unused theme from You Only Live Twice. I don't think it would have been a theme. I think it just would have been background music, incidental music, because there's no vocal. It doesn't have the vibe of a James Bond theme.
Who says that? I mean, we've never heard of any lyrics, but who says that couldn't have happened? Or Brian may have put it out to the universe as like, maybe if he had gotten more encouragement, maybe he would have made lyrics for it.
Could have been, but the fact that it was called Run James Run kind of tells me that it might have been thought of as maybe background for an action scene. Whatever the case, Brian has said in concert before, yeah, I sent this to the James Bond people, but they didn't want to use it. I don't think he ever did. I really doubt he did. That's all I had to say about that. But it's a great piece. I love it. And I learned how to play it, and I've forgotten how to play it since.
And then November 22nd, The Little Girl I Once Knew.
Yep.
Ooh,
That was
another
released.
Pet Sounds signpost.
With There's No Other Like My Baby on the B-side. And wow. And doing the math here, 41 years later, this hand that I'm pointing to made physical contact with the producer, composer, performer of that song.
He said my name.
Yeah. Listen to an earlier episode for the story about that.
He said my name.
Sometime around here, we don't know an exact date. We know that a troop of Girl Scouts visited Capitol Records because there's a picture of Brian outside the Capitol studios in the hallway with a crowd of Girl Scouts and
all these lucky little girls are holding copies of The Little Girl I Once Knew.
Yeah, for the longest time, like I thought it was Brian was in the middle of a session. I'm thinking, okay, if that's November 1965, he must have been recording Run James Run Pet Sounds. But no, because he did all his recording at Western during that time. I don't think he was ever at Capitol around November doing a session.
And just to show our level of hopelessness at this point,
yeah,
we realized the photo with the little girls, you can clearly see a sign for Recording Studio A.
Yeah.
The studios at Western are numbered.
Yeah.
Why do we know this?
I don't know.
What is wrong with us?
I do know that at Gold Star and Capitol, the studios were identified by letter. So that was probably Capitol, because why the hell else would there be a whole crap ton of copies of The Little Girl I Once Knew on hand?
I mean, it could be, my guess is that one of the parents of one of those little girls maybe worked at Capitol or had some kind of connection to Capitol, that they were able to come in and take a little tour or something. And either Brian happened to be at Capitol for some business that day, and they said, hey, why don't you go say hi to these little Girl Scouts? Or maybe it was arranged somehow.
I'll bet it was arranged. It was an arranged photo op, probably.
Yeah, but I'm saying Brian may have already had business in the building. And they said, hey, while you're here, take a moment to meet these little, and that one girl with the braces, oh my God. It's like you can feel their joy.
Yeah.
And I am so envious of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Girl Scouts, the coolest thing we did was take a behind the scenes tour at a Carvel ice cream shop.
Well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but not as cool as meeting Brian Wilson and getting a free record.
You probably got ice cream, though. Ice cream's always awesome.
Yeah. But still.
But yeah, November was loaded up with concerts, or at least the second half of November was loaded up with concerts for the non-Brian Beach Boys. And going into December, still some more concerts. There was still some concerts. Well, actually, December 4th was really their last concert date for a while, really. December 20th, Barbara Ann, backed with Girl Don't Tell Me, was released as a single. And here's where I want to do what might be some myth busting. Common lore is that the reason that The Little Girl I Once Knew peaked at either 25 or 20, I don't remember for sure, and then suddenly dropped off the charts. People say, oh, it's because of those stops in the middle of the song. Well, I don't know, because there are some other people who remember from back then when The Little Girl I Once Knew came out, and it was going up the charts pretty much as fast as any other big Beach Boys hit was at the time. But what put the kibosh on it, though? Barbara Ann.
Less than a month later, Capitol told everybody, push this record instead.
Yeah.
And, which worked because it went to number 2.
Went to number 2. Cashbox had it at number 1.
Yeah. And then December 22nd, we have the 22nd and 29th, there are sessions for Sloop John B, which probably was what they were working on. In there's a couple photos of Brian behind the board at Western, and you can clearly see a carton of eggnog on the desk.
Yeah.
So it probably was either right before or right after Christmas that they were maybe having a little bit of a holiday mood in the studio.
Yeah. Now, there's an interesting story that's been told about the 12-string overdub with Billy Strange. Now, according to Billy Strange, Brian called him on a Sunday and said, hey, on that recording of Sloop John B I did, I want a 12-string on that. Can you meet me at the studio? And Billy told him, well, I don't have a 12-string. So basically, the music store that Brian went to, they were closed because it was Sunday. So he called the owner opened it up for him, and Brian bought Billy a Fender 12 and a twin reverb amp, also a Fender. That is likely incorrect. Number one, because neither of these overdub dates, the 22nd and 29th, those were not Sundays. And Billy Strange said it happened right after Christmas, which would have been, I think, December 26th was a Sunday. And also, what makes that story not quite believable is that Billy had actually performed an electric 12-string in a previous session for Brian earlier in the year. So there could be different things going on. It could be that maybe Billy wasn't able to bring his 12-string for whatever reason. It might have been that he was remembering somebody else buying him the 12-string at some other time. But whatever the case, it was just an interesting story. And I want to send a shout out to Jocelyn Hoisington for clarifying that. She's like, yeah, that story doesn't really add up. But it's some Sloop John B myth. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, some other Sloop John B myth busting I want to do now. Something that was talked about a lot was that supposedly the Beach Boys recorded Sloop John B, a version of it, during the party sessions. I think ever since the Sea of Tunes Unsurpassed Masters series came out, suddenly there was no more talk about that because there was no Sloop John B in those tapes. I think what it was, one of the times when somebody started playing Ticket to Ride on the acoustic 12-string, there was something that sounded a little bit like the 12-string in Sloop John B during Ticket to Ride, but that was just totally coincidental. That's my theory. Anyway, we still have a lot to talk about 1965. Oh, no, we don't, because it's almost the end of the month.
The end of the year.
End of the year. Whew.
Yeah.
But
there's a lot.
Yeah, the year ended with 3 concerts on the 29th, 30th, and 31st. So why did we spend so much time on 1965?
Well,
really?
Because it was a pivotal year. It was a transitional year for the band. And I mean, okay, neither of us were around in 1965.
No.
We weren't born for quite a few years yet. So our only knowledge of 1965 is historical perspective. And I mean, I could totally be wrong, and people who were actually there may throw things at their listening device.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just feels to me that 1965 is when the 60s really got going.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, in terms of music, fashion, a lot of other things, before 1965, it felt like there were still too many things of the 50s hanging around.
Yeah.
There was change, don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
There was definite change, but it still felt like the 50s were lingering too much. And 1965 really felt like that started to shed. I think the Beatles were a big part of that. Like the Beatles coming in, that really changed music, fashion, advertising. I mean, you just look at the Ed Sullivan shows that were aired in 64. The ads were all adults. There were no children, no young people at all.
At least not being marketed to.
In any of the the advertisements were all featuring adults and targeted towards adults.
Yes.
But you look at the episode from that aired in September of 65, the ads had a lot more young people that had more, not real rock and roll, but at least rock and roll flavored music.
They were having a twist party, weren't they?
And even like Barbie dolls. Okay, if you look at the Barbie dolls that were out up until 1965, Barbie was very mature and sophisticated. But starting 65, 66, the dolls started looking a lot younger. And instead of having like a ponytail hairstyle with curled bangs, it was long, straight hair. The clothes became a lot more colorful and less tailored and more mod styles. I think 1965 is when the door started opening to a lot more change. That's also when the miniskirt, when Mary Quant's designs in London really started joining the mainstream.
Yeah.
And skirt lengths started to go higher and higher. And just other things that were coming about in the 60s politically, socially. I think you were starting to see a lot of shifts take hold. With the Beach Boys, it's more like, change was in the air. I mean, it's not like they were like, oh, it's 1965, we must do things differently. It's more like...
It was a natural change. It was organic.
Or just kind of, maybe people just started feeling empowered to, hey, let's do some things differently.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. Brian, in the beginning of 1965, he said, hey, I want to quit the road and stay at home and work on our music. When did the Beatles do the same thing?
Around 66. Yeah, August of 66 is when they... Yeah, and this is another myth-busting thing I want to talk about, because I had heard... I think it was on the Ceylon podcast. They didn't say this as official. I think it was more like just hearsay. Supposedly, the Beatles had visited the Beach Boys backstage at a show in Portland. And I think John said, hey, where's Brian? And Carl said, oh, Brian doesn't tour with us anymore. He stays home to focus on recording in the studio. And John turned to Paul and said, that's a good idea. And I was looking to see what show that might have been. I could not find any instance in which the Beach Boys and the Beatles were both in the Pacific Northwest at the same time ever. So, I don't know. But one thing I also want to say before we wrap up our discussion about 1965, this is a plea to everybody listening here who can help out a friend. A friend of ours who has been a big Beach Boys fan since he heard Don't Worry Baby in 1964. He grew up in New Haven, either still or again lives in New Haven to this day. He went to the Beach Boys concert on May 15th, 1965 in New Haven. Glenn Campbell is in instead of Bruce Johnston. And if I remember what our friend David told us, was that he didn't know that Brian wasn't on the road with them. That was a surprise, seeing Glenn Campbell there. But during that time, the Beach Boys would give Glenn a little solo spot during the show. One person said, yeah, I went to a show during that tour. He took out a banjo and he sang Dang Me. Another person said, yeah, I remember he did Foggy Mountain Breakdown. David does not clearly remember what Glenn did, but he said, as far as I'm concerned, and this is what I'm going to stick with until somebody proves to me otherwise, the night that I saw him, he did Guess I'm Dumb. Which could be plausible that maybe he sang it to a backing track or something, because I can't imagine the Beach Boys being able to perform that or something. But the song would have been released about 2 weeks later. So it's theoretically plausible that it could have happened. But if anybody knows for 100% sure what Glenn did in New Haven on May 15th, 1965, let us know. Hit us up on the social medias or through email. You listen to the end of the show, you'll hear how to reach us. Yeah. So anything else we need to talk about here?
No, I think that's a lot that we've talked about.
That is a lot. Yeah, this is probably going to be
we spent a lot of time putting this together too. A lot of pre-show discussion.
Should we share our notes with people?
Why not?
Okay, yeah, we'll put that up on our show notes page. 24-page
document.
Yeah, that we just typed up really, really fast and all this and just went back and forth.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Hey.
Some of this came from Andrew Doe's site. Some of it came from the John Stebbins and Ian Rustin in concert book. Some came from other sources as well. We'll link though. In fact, many of them are actually already linked in the resources link on our homepage at tunex.fab4it.com. But anyway, we'll call it do you think we should call it a episode at this point?
Sure. Let's do that.
And we'll come back with this topic. Oh, we don't know yet.
Yeah, we have no idea what we're talking about next.
Maybe we'll finally get around to talking about the Ceylon Sailor box. Maybe we won't. But we always have something to talk about.
That's right.
But anyway, it's Sean.
And Lisa.
And bye.
Thank you for listening to the TuneX podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts or iTunes.
You can hear us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and just about every other provider out there. If TuneX isn't on your favorite provider, please let us know.
You can email us at tunexpodcast@gmail.com. Our website, which includes the show notes, is tunex.fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, then the number 4, then I-T.
Feel free to connect with us on social media. TuneX is on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram and Twitter, both under the handle of TuneX Podcast.
Our opening and closing theme, Melody 10, was written and performed by Scattered Frog. All other music and sounds used in this episode remain the properties of their respective copyright holders and are used for the purposes of commentary and review. No infringement is intended.
We'll see you next time, friends. Until then,
Don't back down from that wave.